This is not a story about potatoes. It never was. But the people who needed to understand that were the last ones to realize it, and by the time they did, the supply chain had already moved. The contracts had already been signed. The ships had already been loaded in Vancouver and Prince Rupert, and they were not sailing south. There is a category of dependency so mundane, so embedded in the ordinary functioning of daily life, that it becomes invisible precisely because of how well it works. You do not think about the supply chain behind a fast food order. You do not map the agricultural geography of the frozen French fry. You do not ask which country grows the specific variety of potato that produces the texture and yield that a multinational food corporation requires in quantities that cannot simply be sourced elsewhere without months of reformulation, recontract, and requalification. You order, the fry arrives, the system works, until it doesn't. The russet Burbank potato, grown at commercial scale in the river valleys of Prince Edward Island and the flatlands of Manitoba and Alberta, is not interchangeable with what is grown in Idaho or in the irrigation districts of the American Pacific Northwest. The food science that goes into industrial French fry production is not casual. The moisture content, the starch density, the length to diameter ratio that produces consistent fry yield at the temperatures and throughput volumes that a global fast food operation requires, these are specifications. They are built into procurement contracts and into the machinery of the processing facilities that convert raw agricultural product into the frozen uniform product that arrives in restaurant kitchens across the United States every day without interruption. Without interruption, until the country that grows the potato decides it has other customers, Canada supplies a documented and significant share of the processed potato product consumed by American fast food chains. This is not a disputed figure. It is a supply chain reality that the industry understood and that agricultural economists had cataloged for years. Prince Edward Island alone produces potato volumes at a quality grade that American processors and restaurant chains have structured long-term procurement relationships around. The assumption embedded in those relationships was the same assumption embedded in every other dimension of the North American economic arrangement, that Canada would continue to supply because Canada needed the market. What the procurement managers in Chicago and Atlanta and Columbus did not fully model was the scenario in which Canada decided that other markets were not merely alternatives, but preferences. Not fallbacks, not contingencies, destinations. This is where leverage quietly changes hands. The Indo-Pacific food market is not a marginal outlet for Canadian agricultural surplus. It is a strategic target. Japan's fast food sector, among the most sophisticated and volume-intensive in the world, had been seeking supply chain diversification away from American agricultural intermediaries for years before the 2025 trade disruption. South Korea's processed food industry had similar structural motivations. The growing middle-class consumption base across Southeast Asia represented demand growth that dwarfed the incremental gains available in a saturated North American market where the relationship had always been managed as extraction rather than partnership. Canadian agricultural exporters understood this. They had understood it for years. What they had lacked was not the market knowledge or the logistics capability. What they had lacked was the political permission to act on what they knew. The trade arrangement with the United States had functioned as a gravitational field, not because it was the best available option, but because it was the established one. Inertia is its own form of constraint. The tariffs broke the inertia. When the Trump administration moved to restructure the terms of North American agricultural trade, and when the demand arrived, framed as a correction, as a reassertion of American market priority, what it actually produced was the release of a pressure that had been building for a decade. Canadian agricultural producers and processing companies that had been developing Indo-Pacific relationships quietly, cautiously, without burning the North American bridge they were standing on, suddenly found themselves in a political environment where diversification was not just commercially rational, it was nationally sanctioned. The statement that came from Ottawa, that Canadian potatoes feed Canadians, was not agricultural policy. It was a declaration of the direction in which the reorientation was moving. It was the moment a supplier announced without ambiguity that the assumption of American priority access was no longer operative. Most people read it as rhetoric. Supply chain managers read it as a contract notice. The fast food industry operates on margins that have no tolerance for input cost volatility at scale. A 2% increase in the cost of processed potato product across the volume consumed by a chain operating tens of thousands of locations is not an abstraction. It is a line item that moves quarterly earnings. It is a number that appears in analyst calls and in the correspondence between procurement executives and their boards. The industry had priced Canadian supply as a stable, long-term input. It had not priced Canadian supply as a negotiating position in a geopolitical dispute that the industry had no ability to influence. This is the structural problem that no amount of corporate contingency planning could fully address. The alternative supply sources for the specific grade and volume of processed potato product that American fast food operations require do not exist at scale outside of existing North American production. American domestic supply, concentrated in Idaho and Washington state, operates at capacity levels that are already committed. The additional volume that would be required to replace Canadian supply, if that supply were redirected to Asian markets, could not be produced in a single growing season. It could not be produced in two. Agricultural infrastructure is not a switch. It is a cycle, and cycles do not respond to demand signals in the time frame that a quarterly earnings report requires. The fast food corporations were not the architects of this dependency. They were the inheritors of it. Decades of procurement optimization had produced supply chains that were efficient precisely because they were concentrated and because they assumed relationship continuity. Efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. The industry had chosen efficiency. It was now discovering the cost of that choice. What made the situation structurally significant, beyond the immediate operational disruption, was the direction of the trade reorientation that was occurring simultaneously with the North American dispute. Every container of processed potato product that left a Canadian port bound for Yokohama or Manila or Jakarta was a container that was not available for American distribution. But it was also something more than that. It was a relationship. A commercial relationship with its own contracts, its own quality specifications, its own logistics infrastructure, its own payment terms, and its own renewal cycle. Commercial relationships have momentum. They do not dissolve because a diplomatic temperature changes. The Japanese importer who restructured its supply chain around Canadian product in 2025 did not do so with the intention of reversing that decision when Washington changed its tone. It did so because the economics were sound, because the quality was established, and because the supply chain that now ran through Vancouver was more reliable, from its perspective, than a supply chain that ran through an American intermediary whose own input costs had become unpredictable. This is not a crisis. It is a reordering. The American fast food industry became, in this configuration, not just an economic casualty of a trade dispute. It became a symbol of a structural reality that the broader economic and political establishment had been slow to process. The symbol was not flattering. A nation that had spent decades projecting economic dominance across the hemisphere was now in a position where the availability of one of the most ordinary items on its most ordinary menus was subject to the agricultural export decisions of a country it had been treating as a subordinate. There is a particular kind of vulnerability that reveals itself only when the system that conceals it is stressed. For 80 years, the North American agricultural supply chain had functioned without stress. Products moved south, payments moved north. The arrangement was so stable, so thoroughly normalized, that no one in a position of American strategic or economic authority had spent serious time asking what would happen if it changed. The question seemed academic. The answer, when the stress arrived, was not academic at all. The menu price increases that began appearing in American fast food chains in mid-2025 were attributed, in public communications, to general input cost inflation and supply chain adjustments. These descriptions were accurate, but incomplete. The more precise description would have acknowledged that a portion of the cost increase was structural, the result of a supply reorientation that was not going to reverse, and that the procurement relationships that had held input costs stable for years were being renegotiated or replaced under conditions far less favorable than those that had originally produced them. Consumers noticed the price. They did not see the supply chain behind it. They did not need to. The price was the message, translated from the language of agricultural trade policy into the language of the drive-through window. Mark Carney did not invent the leverage that Canada held over American food supply chains. He recognized it. And in recognizing it, he named it in terms that could not be misread. Canadian potatoes feed Canadians. The sentence is simple. Its implications are not. It means that the allocation of Canadian agricultural production is a Canadian decision. It means that American access to that production is not guaranteed by geography or by historical arrangement or by the size of the American economy. It means that the supplier has customers, and that the American customer is one of them, not the only one, not the preferred one, not the one whose access is protected by anything other than the terms of an ongoing commercial and diplomatic relationship that Canada is now managing on its own terms. This is the moment power stops explaining itself. The strategic significance of the potato is not the potato. It is the demonstration that the category of goods over which Canada exercises this kind of quiet, structural leverage is not limited to oil or electricity or critical minerals. It extends into the agricultural supply chains that feed ordinary American commerce. It extends into the inputs that underlie the most visible and most culturally embedded dimensions of American consumer life. When the French fry becomes a supply chain problem, when the menu price at the drive-thru reflects a geopolitical reorientation that began in Ottawa, the abstraction of trade policy becomes immediate and personal in a way that financial dependency figures never quite achieve. Empires have been embarrassed by smaller things. But the embarrassment is not the point. The point is the architecture that the embarrassment reveals. The point is the map of dependencies that suddenly becomes visible when a system is stressed. The point is the list of inputs that the American economy had assumed would always arrive, and the growing recognition that assumptions are not guarantees, and that the countries which had been supplying those inputs had been doing the math, quietly, patiently, over years, on what it would mean to supply them somewhere else. The ships leaving Vancouver were loaded with potato product bound for markets that had not existed as serious commercial destinations 5 years earlier. The contracts governing those shipments had renewal clauses. The logistics infrastructure supporting them was being expanded. The relationships behind them were deepening. None of that was going to reverse, because a press secretary described it as temporary. By the time the procurement adjustment is complete, by the time the American fast food supply chain has been rebuilt around whatever inputs remain available at whatever cost the new market equilibrium produces, the Canadian agricultural sector will have already established the alternative relationships that were built during the disruption. Those relationships will persist. They will be serviced. They will become the new baseline against which future allocation decisions are made. The fry that was always there will cost more now, and the country that grew the potato will be doing business in growing volume with customers who did not spend 80 years assuming the supply was theirs by right. History does not reverse because it is misunderstood. It continues, and the supply chain moves with it.